This is GM Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Alexander Grischuk and Magnus Carlsen duking it out. And here you see a handshake as both players take their seats. Magnus sitting in front of the black pieces, and he adjusts his pieces carefully. The arbiter starts the clock, and Sasha Grischuk starts the game off with one c4, the English opening. Carlsen responds to the principled e5. We have a reverse Sicilian as Grischuk fianchettos his bishop, and Magnus strikes in the center with d7, d5, playing the most principled line of the English. And this literally resembles a reverse accelerated dragon. Very, very popular line. Both sides developing their pieces. Magnus positioning his dark squared bishop on e7. Now the other bishop generally goes to e6 in this line. And Grischuk prepares queenside expansion with b2, b4. Magnus does not hamper him in that, and he moves his rook to e8. And Grischuk seeming a little bit surprised. Now the move b5, it would win the pawn on e5, but there are a lot of lines where black actually sacrifices that pawn and gets a pretty big initiative. But Grischuk looks pretty surprised at Magnus's decision to not prevent him from playing b5. Let's see if that is the choice that he makes. You can see the onlookers looking very intently as the game starts to heat up, but Sasha decides against playing b5, and instead he fianchettos his bishop to b2. And now Magnus does have the move knight c4, but he chooses not to play it. He drops the bishop back to f8. Now the rook defends the pawn on e5, and so the knight on c6 is free to roam about the cabin, and it moves into d4. Now a trade on d4 would result in the opening of the e-file, and because Magnus is positioned that rook on e8, that would be in his favor. So Grischuk, he forces a trade on his terms, and he plays the move e3. But now the d3 pawn is somewhat weakened. So later on in the game, not now because the b7 pawn is going to hang, but maybe after a preliminary c6, Magnus could develop his light-squared bishop to f5 and start pressuring that pawn on d3, but instead he plays a7, a5, and he continues to expand on the queen side and shoves that pawn down to a4 and isolates Grischuk's pawn on b5. That's a pretty classic maneuver in this sort of position. The position, to me, looks about equal. Grischuk plays queen d1 to e2, vacating the d1 square, possibly for a rook, and possibly he is trying to counteract the move bishop f5, which Magnus plays anyway, and yes, he does. He plays rook f1 to d1. Magnus immediately follows up with queen d8 to c8, defending the pawn on b7, but that queen is now under the x-ray of the other rook, and I like how Grischuk is playing this rook a8 to a5, and Magnus brings his rook into the game and puts pressure on the pawn on b5. Now Grischuk's knight on c3 cannot move that easily, and instead Grischuk takes care of the other side of the board. He pushes h2, h4, grabbing space on the king side. Is he really planning to push the g-pawn as well? That remains to be seen, but what bothers me about Magnus's position is I don't really see a plan for him. Grischuk has that weakness on b5, but it's very well defended by his knight. In fact, I don't see exactly how either side are going to improve their position. So you can see them playing slowly. Grischuk, king g1 to h2, continuing to make small improving moves on the king side. And if Magnus falls asleep, then I actually think that Grischuk might start pushing his g-pawn down the board, g4, g5. Magnus's king could start feeling uncomfortable in that scenario. And Magnus brings his bishop back to e6. He takes the sting out of the move g4, and maybe that bishop is going to sink its teeth into the b3 square. It's got a nice outpost on b3, but that would continue the brain drain from the king side. And Grischuk plays rook g1. He is definitely thinking about starting to push that g-pawn down the board to g4, maybe even to g5. Yes, he's got his king there, but he's got plenty of pieces to protect his king and attack black's king at the same time. And this is giving Magnus a pretty good amount of pause. How is Magnus going to deal with the potential of white pushing that g-pawn? Is Magnus going to push his f-pawn down to f5? Is he going to bring his queen up to d7 and maybe start to trade minor pieces with knight b6 to d5? That rook on a5, it looks cool, but it's kind of just stuck there staring at the pawn on b5. It's not really participating in the game, and Magnus is taking a pretty long time here to figure out how to better coordinate his pieces. No question in my mind that Grischuk has won the opening battle and stands better in this medal game. A nervous glance at the clock there as Magnus can't seem to find the proper way to coordinate his pieces. And the spectators shifting around and feeling nervous, and Magnus hesitating. I think he was about to shove his rook from e8 to d8, not sure exactly. And Magnus decides to continue thinking. He must be getting a little bit low on time at this point. rook e8 to d8. That would make sense if he wants to put pressure on the d3 pawn, but I don't really see a follow-up to that move, and perhaps neither does Magnus. Maybe he doesn't see anything better, and he does ultimately play rook d8. And now the big question for Grischuk, will he play g3, g4 to try to open up that g-file and try to get to Black's king? Is that going to happen, or is Grischuk going to take a slower approach? Is he going to continue improving his position? And he's got ways to do that. He can play rook c1 to d1 if he's worried about the d3 pawn. And a quick glance at the clock, Grischuk is going to have to make a decision soon. And, well, you know what I want to see. I want to see Sasha pushing that g-pawn up to g4 and going for Magnus's throat, and that is exactly what he does, and Magnus was expecting it. He responds with the immediate bishop e7, and having said A, you have to say B, so I'm expecting the move g4, g5, and those pawns serve as battering rams, shattering the king position in front of Black's king, and Magnus looks mighty unhappy to see that on the board. We have a trade on g5. Bishop f5 is met with bishop e4, neutralizing the attack on the d3 pawn. And let's see how Magnus addresses the threats, the storm clouds that are gathering around his king. Will he trade the bishops? No, he will not. He moves his queen into position, queen c8 to e6. And now the question is, how is Grischuk going to exploit the fact that the king side is now opened up, and he moves his rook convincingly with authority up to g3, and perhaps he's trying to bring the other rook not to g1, but maybe even to h1. And then once he drops his king from h2 to g1, his king is going to be surrounded by friendly forces, and his rook is going to be sitting on an open file and a direct artery to Black's king, and he sacrifices the pawn on b5, but Grischuk decides that that pawn is really not that important. But if his attack does not work out, then Magnus will have something to hang his hat on. The bishop on b2 also needs to be carefully watched by Grischuk. It's not currently attacked, but if his queen moves out of e2, then that bishop is going to hang. And if the bishop moves away, then the a3 pawn hangs as well. And Grischuk continues to assemble his forces on the king side. King h2 to g2 is his move. And next up, he is planning to bring his rook from c1 to h1, and then queen h5 is going to create the first mate threats of the game. Look how methodically Alexander Grischuk is assembling his pieces on the king side, and Magnus decides to run with his own 2 feet. What a move. King g8 to f8. The king making a mad dash out of the king side, but that involves giving up the c7 pawn, which Grischuk happily takes. And then he drops the rook back to c4, Magnus bringing his knight back to b6. Of course, Grischuk does not want repetition. He moves his rook back to c1, rook b3 by Magnus as he furiously tries to develop counterplay on the queen side and in the center, and there comes Grischuk's queen, and the king continues to run away from the king side, king e8, and somehow the king is a little bit safer on e8 than it was on g8, and Grischuk has to move his bishop back, and the king continues his mad dash out of the king side. Now it's in the center. Another glance at the clock. Grischuk seems to be getting nervous. The pawn on a3 is hanging, and knight c5 check forces a trade of minor pieces, and now the pawn on e5 is hanging. How is Magnus going to defend it? He isn't. He's going to take on d3, and Grischuk is going to recapture on e5. And now a great move by Magnus, rook c8, to force another pair of rooks off the board. And Black's king is looking safer than ever, and Magnus takes on a3, but Grischuk continues to hammer at him, and he plays rook f3, but Magnus's knight comes back just in time, and it defends f7. And now bishop f8, an amazing move, forcing the knight off the board, and f7 is going to hang. And how is Magnus going to recapture? And there comes the rook. The dam has been breached, or has it? The king continues to run. Queen c6, queen f3, queen d5. Who does a queen trade benefit? Black's passed pawns are actually more far advanced than White's, arguably. This is a crazy endgame. Magnus's a pawn moves down to a3. Who's going to promote first? Grischuk tries to stop him with his pawn. Rook c8 check. And the rook's going to drop down to c1. Grischuk is just in time to stop Magnus's a-pawn. But will he stop his b-pawn as well? I think Magnus might be winning here, because Magnus's king is going to stop White's pawns, and White will not be able to do the same. Magnus Carlsen wins the game. What an incredible display. Make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these videos. Thank you for watching.